Stephen Nolan, BBC Radio 5 Live.
Well, let's return to the story about clubbing returning to the UK with a huge test event that finished earlier this hour. 3,000 clubbers took to the dance floor at Bramley Moor Dock Warehouse for the first of two big dance events there this weekend. Ticket holders didn't need to wear masks or socially distance inside, but they did need to have tested negative for coronavirus by having a lateral flow test beforehand. It's the latest part of the event's research programme, a series of government trials on crowd safety during COVID. Earlier, I asked the programme's scientific advisor, Professor Paul Monks, if the people enjoying themselves realised they were part of a real-world experiment.
What we want to know is, will people go and take tests? Will they go to stations? How many people return the PCR tests, the tests after the event? So there's a lot of data around people's behaviours and testing alongside absolutely the risk. Now, I am not going to sit on the radio and say these events have no risk. That would be wrong. What we're saying is, what we've done is we've designed a set of experiments to minimise that risk to the actual customer. So but they are guinea pigs in one sense. You're right. They are guinea pigs, that we're using them to test the whole end-to-end question of testing events, interactions, behaviours, adherence to advice, and then understand that within the environment for that risk. In order to understand this disease and how to manage this disease, we're going to have to experiment, because it's not going to go away in the long term. It's not going to be pandemic. It's going to be endemic in the long term as well.
But when you're talking, Paul, about we're going to have to experiment, rather than trying to create new case studies, don't we have enough from the hundreds of thousands of people who have had COVID for them to be the case studies? Why do we need to load risk onto another new cohort of young people?
I don't think I really see it like that. I mean, what we're trying to do is look at events and how to run those safely, and how to reduce the risk, around these sort of events. Risk will always exist. Risk exists if you go to the shop. Risk exists if you go, if you get on the bus. And it's about, in some senses, understanding that, and then, trying to work to support people to make more intelligent choices around that.
And here we are talking about this on a network BBC programme. So the experiment itself has profile, and it's in the news. Mm-hmm. What message does this generally send out? Is it now safe to send out a message that to, I don't know, young people, whatever that means anymore, let's say 30-year-olds and under, that it's safe? Because if you can go clubbing, you can basically do anything. Is that a safe message?
So again, the issues around this is an experiment. We know all the names. Everybody's consented. We can test and trace these individuals and suggest isolation if there are any things. So this is a much more controlled environment in some senses, in knowing what the demographic is, the people who are there, in order again to minimise that sort of risk. I think we've been very careful. You're talking about signalling, and signalling is incredibly important, around this sort of thing. But at the same time, we've got to accept that we want to try and understand how to live with COVID, and that's going to be an important part of our future.
Well, what do you think? Is it an experiment that you support? 08085 909 693. Dr. Deepti Gurdasani is a clinical epidemiologist at St Mary's College at the University of London. Deepti, good evening.
Good evening.
What do you think of the experiment?
I think it's completely unethical. I don't actually understand how it was approved by any ethics committee. I mean, what's being done here is deliberately exposing people to the risk of contracting a virus in a crowded indoor environment where we know it can super spread, while withholding the very measures that we know protect people. And this is an infection that has no treatment. People can get long COVID without any treatment, and sadly, some of them can die, or their relatives can die. And I don't really understand what the arrangements are for sort of who takes liability for that, for example.
Well, surely it's unfair to say that there are no control mechanisms. The big one is everybody in there is tested before they get in.
Well, no, that's not a control mechanism. In fact, the Medicine and Health Regulatory Authority a few days ago actually released a statement saying they were really concerned that testing was being used in this way because they hadn't authorized the tests as green light tests. They had only authorized them as red light tests. So they were concerned that their authorization had been stretched in the way the government was using it because, as you've said earlier, they're not accurate enough to rule out infection, which means people will get in who are infected with the potential of super spreading in exactly the sort of environment that happens in.
So if one or two or three people, I think what the professor said earlier was that it's 3 in 1,000 is what the statistics are suggesting. So there's 3,000 in there. Let's say there are 5 or 6 people in there with COVID. And by the way, the lateral flow test might have picked some of them up and then they wouldn't get in. So let's say there are 2 people in there in a crowd of 3,000.
Well, I first want to say that the prevalence is 1 in 500 in that age group. So the prevalence that was being cited was across the population. So, it's a bit higher than that. But sure, let's go ahead with, let's say there are 3 people. Yeah.
So you're an epidemiologist, 3 people in there with COVID.
Yeah.
And they're dancing and they're clubbing and they're doing whatever they do.
Yeah.
How would that
sounds
play
really
out
small,
in terms
doesn't
of
it?
the
It sounds
spread
really
of that
small.
disease?
So this is a disease that's spread by aerosol transmission. Let me give you an example. There was, you may have heard of this because it's quite a famous example now. There was a choir practice in Washington in March of last year when the community rate was thought to be low. And I think there were 60 people who attended choir. There was one person infected who, infected most of the people in that choir. 3 people got hospitalized and 2 people died. So we know in COVID, most people don't actually give rise to infection. But what we get are these super spreading events sometimes where one person can infect many, many people, especially in environments like this when it's crowded and there's less distancing. We're not just having one event. We're having multiple events where, for each event, a few people can get in. At some point, you're going to have a super spreading event. I mean, we saw that with the Cheltenham races as well, where, there were cases linked to that, which potentially led to community transmission following that, although we didn't have good test and trace to pick up most of that at that point in time. So we don't know what impact it had. So, unfortunately, even 3 people in one event is a risk, particularly when you're having many such events. And this is an infection that can super spread with aerosol transmission.
But this is a government-approved trial.
I mean, that's what puzzles me. I would really like to see the protocol and the ethical approval because, I've applied for ethical approval for many studies and I cannot understand how this could have been approved. I mean, we heard Professor Monks talk about, we're trying to keep people safe. We're looking for measures that keep people safe. I mean, the thing is, we've been studying this for 15 months. We know what keeps people safe: social distancing, ventilation, masking. These are known measures now that protect people. And I don't know what ethics committee would allow us to take them away from a group. It's sort of like saying, let's look at whether seatbelts work when we know they do and have people in a speeding car and say, suspend the use of seatbelts and then look at the end of the trial and see how many people die. I mean, the outcome of this trial is how many people get infected. And, some of those people who get infected might develop long COVID. Some of their relatives might get sick. Some of them might have relatives who die. And who's liable for that when that happens? And, when we know what protects people, how can we take away known measures that protect people in the midst of a pandemic when we still do have significant community transmission happening and those people are not vaccinated?
But isn't the risk extremely low given the age profile of the people and the lateral flow test? So I know that the age profile is not a total defence. I know that the lateral flow tests are not a total defence. But the combination of both, does that not make the risk extremely low?
No, it doesn't. It's not just one event. There are multiple events happening. Death is not the only risk, right? And these people have relatives as well. So there are more than 1 million people living with long COVID, and the majority of them are young, healthy people in that age group. So 1 in 5 people who get infected in that age group will develop symptoms that last more than 5 weeks. They'll have relatives. They can take infection into their households. And this is exactly the sort of place where it happens. People are talking loudly. There's a lot of aerosols being pushed out. People are in a very crowded indoor environment. So if there's a super spreading event, you would expect a large number of people to get infected, not just a few people, because of the sort of nature of this disease, like we've seen again and again in these sort of environments. I mean, this is I mean, I don't understand this experiment because we've had so many real world situations where this has happened, unfortunately, because we didn't know that much about the virus or protections weren't in place. And we've seen huge levels of transmission just with a few people or even one person, being infected, but in these specific environments because they really provide a fertile ground for transmission.
The Times tomorrow, Deepti, their front page has the following headline: Hug friends in a fortnight. The story reads that cases have dropped 40% in a week. Family and friends will be allowed to hug in just over a fortnight under the first significant easing of social distancing restrictions. That's what the Times is reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I really worry about this sort of reporting. I mean, I feel like we've sort of decided that because about 20% of our population is fully vaccinated and 50% is partially vaccinated, if we open up fully at this point in time, things will be fine. And people keep citing Israel without realizing that Israel has taken a very different route. They've been very, very careful about containing community transmission during vaccine rollout. I mean, they opened their schools only after 80% of their adult population were vaccinated, and even after that, children were wearing masks in school, socially distancing. They had mandates outdoors and indoors for wearing masks, and it's only last week, I think, that the outdoor mandate was dropped. So, people think that because Israel is doing well, we can, open up now. But Israel was very, very careful about how it controlled community transmission and took measures that allowed that to happen. If we open up now the way we are, cases can still surge back and we can undo a lot of what's been done, especially with this new variant spreading. Yeah.
We're seeing lots of positive statistics, though, and maybe you can interpret them for us.
Absolutely.
The Times article, for example, saying that there were 54,200 people living with COVID-19 in the week ending April the 17th. That's about 1 in 1,000 people, the lowest figure since the week to September the 5th of last year. 22 million people, equivalent to 1 in 3 of the population, live in areas that have not reported a single COVID-19 death for a month.
Yes, absolutely. And we know that deaths do lag cases. So what I want to say there is, so this is exactly where we were around September 3rd of last year. And in 4 weeks' time from September 3rd, we were essentially at a point in time that we need to lock down when schools opened. And I know things are very positive now, but let me tell you, when schools opened in March, and this is something I don't see discussed in the media a lot, in 2 weeks' time, cases among children rose very, very rapidly so that they had the highest infection rates across all age groups, and are also
Where is that, sorry?
That's in England. And in Scotland, infection rates in children rose about 4 times since 22nd Feb. And what's apparent if you look at the data is that in Scotland, of course, you saw an increase in R above 1 briefly. And in England, also, you saw R creeping at 1. And then Easter break happened. And Easter break, all the infections fell again, including children, right? We only had schools open for 2 weeks. And even then, we saw a big impact on infection children. But it was only 2 weeks. And after Easter break, all those drops resumed. Now the schools open again without many mitigations in place, and the government is even planning to remove masks. We expect to see those rises resume because they were happening in March, but weren't being talked about a lot. And in September, this is exactly what happened. We had infection rates at this level in September, and in 4 weeks' time, they had quadrupled. And I'm not saying that will happen to that extent now because we have a level of vaccination in the population, but it's not going to protect a huge amount against transmission in those younger age groups that are not vaccinated.
Yeah, but it might not prevent COVID being transmitted to those younger age groups. But statistically, Deepti, the vast majority of those younger age groups will have a mild to moderate illness and will get past it and will be okay. And we've got to open up sometime. And then there's another school of thought,
I'm not
isn't
saying
there?
It's indefinite. I'm not saying it's indefinite at all. I'm just
But are you saying it's premature?
I am saying it's premature, yeah. And I do disagree that young people don't get affected. I mean, I just want to say not only are there more than 1 million people living with long COVID and the majority of them being young and healthy, 500,000 people have had symptoms for more than 6 months. So it's not a disease that, when I say 5 weeks, people think, oh yeah, okay, fine. that's just like a bad flu. But 500,000 people who are living in the UK now, most of them young, without pre-existing illnesses, have had symptoms for 6 months or more. And that's not mild.
Someone's just tweeted and said, do we really have to listen to this doctor on 5 Live every week? She just wants to see us locked up forever.
No, I don't. I absolutely don't. In fact, I mean, that's the sort of thing we've been trying to prevent, because the way you prevent being locked down forever is controlling transmission when you need to control it. We are going to have a large proportion of our population vaccinated very, very soon. We could wait for that. We could bring our community transmission lower and have, things like mitigations in schools. These are simple measures that are not lockdowns, but would make a huge difference and keep everyone safer. We could fix our test, trace, isolate, and support system, which is not lockdown, but would really reduce the impact of a lot of things that are happening now as we open up. But if we don't do that, then yes, we might end up in another lockdown, not because I want us to. I'm trying to prevent that happening. But, unfortunately, our government has done this again and again and again.
But the basic messages that I'm hearing are, Deepti, that it is, again, relatively safe in an outdoor environment, especially coming into the hotter weather, because that is the best time of the year. If we're going to have some type of the year to ease restrictions, it's better in the warm weather. So if we've got more and more of our population vaccinated, if we're getting into a spring-summer period where the weather is hotter, and if a lot of the permitted activities are outside, is that not a very good environment to give a population at least some respite from these horrendous restrictions?
I mean, I'm not saying that people shouldn't meet up outdoors in a socially distanced way. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that, crowded events like this, indoors or outdoors, people need to take precautions. Like there needs to be wearing masks, there needs to be social distancing, particularly in those indoor environments, and, good ventilation. I mean, that's just asking people to take precautions.